The words landed like a verdict, cold and absolute, delivered without hesitation or remorse. This is a problem that even my doctoral candidates cannot solve. Professor Eleanor Hayes set her marker down on the lectern with a deliberate, unhurried click, the kind of sound a person makes when they are absolutely certain they will never be challenged. She turned her gaze to the back of the room, past the rows of eager faces and open laptops, past the fluorescent glare bouncing off whiteboard glass, until her eyes settled on the young man sitting in the last row, third seat from the left. He was wearing a plain gray hoodie. His notebook was open. He had not looked up from it since she began speaking. Perhaps, Eleanor said, her voice carrying that particular blend of patience and contempt that only the truly arrogant can master, you should consider focusing on something more suited to your level. The lecture hall erupted in scattered laughter. Not the cruel, explosive kind, but the worse variety. Easy, reflexive, the laughter of people who do not think twice because they have never had reason to. And in that moment, not a single person in the room knew that Marcus Reed had already spent years working at a level of mathematical depth that most professors in that building had never approached. Not a single person knew that the quiet young man in the gray hoodie had sat in the back of rooms like this one. His entire academic life, not because he lacked confidence, but because he had learned, slowly and painfully, that the world would underestimate him regardless of where he sat. 10 minutes later, when Marcus set down his marker and stepped back from the board, the laughter was gone. The room was completely silent, and the slow, irreversible collapse of one woman's career had already begun. Marcus Reed had turned 22 years old the previous October, and he had spent the majority of those years being invisible in exactly the rooms where he should have been most visible. He was a senior at Hargrove University, one of the most respected mathematics programs on the East Coast, and he carried his enrollment there the way he carried most things quietly, without announcement, without the kind of performance that draws attention. His clothes were never remarkable. He favored hoodies in neutral colors, dark jeans worn at the knees, sneakers that had seen better days. His backpack was a battered olive canvas thing with a broken zipper on the front pocket that he had repaired twice with safety pins. He sat at the back of every classroom not because he was disengaged, but because he found the distance clarifying it, allowed him to observe the full shape of a lecture, to notice where the logic bent and where it held, without the pressure of a professor's gaze landing on him every few minutes, expecting performance. His classmates had constructed a version of Marcus that bore almost no resemblance to reality. He was the quiet one, the background one, the one who never raised his hand aggressively, who never lingered after class to perform brilliance for an audience of one. A student named Derek, who sat in the third row and spoke loudly and often, had once described Marcus to a mutual acquaintance as probably coasting. Another student, a woman named Priya, who was otherwise kind and thoughtful, had admitted she sometimes forgot he was in the seminar at all. These assessments were not malicious. They were simply the result of people seeing what they expected to see, filtered through every assumption they had absorbed about what intellectual greatness was supposed to look like and where it was supposed to come from. Marcus had grown up in Baltimore, the son of a high school biology teacher and a man who repaired HVAC systems for commercial buildings. His parents were not wealthy, but they were precise and disciplined people who believed with absolute conviction that rigor and patience were the most reliable forms of power available to someone in their son's position. His father used to say, while bent over some complex mechanical diagram at the kitchen table, that the machine does not care who you are, it only cares whether you understand it. Marcus had taken this to heart in ways his father probably never anticipated. By the time he was 15, he was working through graduate-level textbooks on his own, not because a teacher had assigned them, but because he had simply run out of other things to read. By 17, he had quietly entered and won two national mathematics competitions under an initial-only registration that kept his identity obscured. He had done this not out of paranoia, but out of a simple desire to know whether his work could stand on its own, disconnected from his face and his name and every assumption those things carried. The results had told him everything he needed to know. At Hargrove, the mathematics department had a reputation built on tradition and selectivity and Professor Eleanor Hayes was arguably its most prominent figure. She had published extensively, chaired two national committees, and was frequently described in departmental literature as a towering intellect. She taught the advanced analysis seminar that Marcus had enrolled in as part of his senior thesis requirements, and from the very first week, the dynamic between them had followed a pattern so familiar to Marcus that it almost felt scripted. He would raise his hand. She would look past it. He would write something in his notebook. She would call on someone else. He would sit with the answer inside him like a stone in still water, and the surface of things would remain undisturbed. He had learned not to take it personally, because the personal was not really what it was about. It was structural, atmospheric, the kind of bias that does not announce itself with cruelty, but simply operates as a default setting, invisible to the people who benefit from it, and exhausting to the people who don't. One afternoon in mid October, while gathering his things after a lecture, Marcus overheard two of his classmates near the door. One of them, a lanky student named Garrett, who wore Oxford shirts and spoke with the casual assurance of someone who had never doubted his right to be in a room, was saying to his companion, "I give it 50-50 odds that he even passes the midterm." The companion laughed softly. Marcus zipped his backpack. He picked up his notebook. He allowed himself very briefly the smallest possible smile. Not bitter, not wounded, but the smile of someone who knows something the room does not yet know, and who has learned that patience is its own form of answer. He walked out into the October afternoon, and the sunlight was very bright, and he had work to do. The bias did not announce itself dramatically. It accumulated the way sediment does slowly, in layers, until the weight of it became undeniable. Professor Eleanor Hayes had built her pedagogy around a specific idea of merit, and that idea had a very particular shape. It favored students who had attended elite preparatory academies and arrived at Hargrove trailing recommendation letters that read like small monuments to their own promise. It favored students who spoke in seminars with the fluid confidence of people who had been told since childhood that their voices mattered and their ideas were worth the air they displaced. It favored students who dressed a certain way, who knew certain names, who laughed at certain references. Eleanor was not, by her own understanding, a prejudiced person. She thought of herself as a rigorous intellectual who simply recognized quality when she encountered it, and who had no patience for mediocrity regardless of its origin. This self image was the most dangerous thing about her. One Tuesday, in November, Eleanor was leading the seminar through a particularly dense section on functional analysis when Marcus, who had been tracking a subtle inconsistency in the approach for several minutes, raised his hand. Eleanor's gaze swept the room and landed briefly on the back row before continuing to the front. She called on a student named Theo, who offered an answer that was technically correct but underdeveloped. Marcus kept his hand up. After Theo sat down, Eleanor moved forward in her notes. Marcus lowered his hand. A few minutes later, he raised it again, and this time Eleanor did look at him, with the particular expression of someone who is granting a small and somewhat burdensome favor. "Yes," she said, in the tone of a door opening only part way. Marcus said, calmly, and without preamble, that he believed there was an alternative approach to the boundary condition problem. They were currently working through one that might simplify the proof considerably by reframing the constraint in terms of operator norms, rather than pointwise convergence. The room shifted slightly. A few students looked at him with genuine interest. Eleanor did not. That approach, she said, contradicts the standard framework established in the literature. Not contradicts, Marcus said. Extends, maybe. The standard framework assumes compactness in a way that the general case doesn't necessarily require. A beat of silence. Then Eleanor said, with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes, "Are you suggesting the textbook is wrong?" "No," Marcus said. "I'm suggesting there might be a more general path." Several students laughed. It was not mean laughter, exactly, but it carried the weight of a social verdict. The kind of laughter that sides with authority simply because authority is present. Eleanor moved on without further acknowledgement. She did not revisit the point. She did not note it in her own materials for later consideration. She simply continued as though the exchange had not occurred. And the seminar rolled forward. and Marcus wrote 3 more lines in his notebook that he did not share with anyone. After class, a junior professor named Dr. Raymond Okafor, who taught number theory and occasionally sat in on Eleanor's seminar as an observer, caught up with Marcus in the corridor. He had seen the exchange. He had seen it before, in various forms, over the course of the semester. Your operator norm approach, he said quietly, walking alongside Marcus toward the stairwell, is actually a significant idea. I'd like to hear more about it sometime. Marcus thanked him without breaking stride. That same afternoon, Dr. Okafor stopped by Eleanor's office. He did not want to be confrontational. He phrased it carefully, with the diplomatic tact of someone who has learned how to say difficult things to people with more institutional power. I think you might want to look more closely at some of Reed's work, he said. He has some genuinely unusual approaches. Eleanor looked up from her papers with the expression of someone who has been interrupted mid-thought by a minor inconvenience. She smiled thinly. I appreciate the input, Raymond, she said, and she returned to her papers. And Dr. Okafor walked back to his office with the specific, tired feeling of a person who has tried the right thing and watched it fail. The Department of Mathematics at Hargrove held an annual academic colloquium in late November, a full-day event that brought together faculty, graduate students, and invited scholars from other institutions. It was the kind of gathering that functioned simultaneously as an intellectual forum and a social performance. Papers were presented, positions were debated, and the subtle hierarchies of academic life were reinforced or renegotiated with every exchange. Professor Eleanor Hayes viewed the colloquium as her natural territory. She had presented at it for 11 consecutive years. She chaired the afternoon panel. She was, by any reasonable measure, the gravitational center of the event, and she moved through it with the ease of someone who has long since stopped needing to prove anything and has begun simply occupying the space that proof has earned. On the afternoon of the colloquium, after the formal presentations had concluded, Eleanor chose to do something she had done before in these settings, something that had always worked well for her. She posed an open challenge to the room. She called it an exercise in collaborative thinking. What it actually was, and what everyone present understood it to be, was a demonstration of intellectual dominance, a way of reminding the assembled scholars that her command of the field was both broad and deep, that she could reach into territory where others became uncertain and hold herself there without effort. The problem she chose was not from the current curriculum. It was derived from an open question in ergodic theory that had appeared in a recent preprint from a European research group, a boundary problem involving measure-preserving transformations under non-compact group actions, a question that sat at the intersection of several subfields and had resisted clean resolution precisely because the standard tools of each subfield became inadequate when applied to the full generality of the case. Eleanor wrote it on the board with the particular flourish of someone who already knows the audience cannot follow. And she said, in the pleasant voice of someone arranging a display, they fully intend to win. This is a problem that even my doctoral candidates have not been able to resolve. If anyone in the room has a fresh perspective, now would be the time. The room stirred. Senior faculty leaned forward to study the board. 2 visiting professors exchanged a look that suggested recognition and significant respect for the difficulty of the problem. Graduate students sat very still, and then Eleanor turned her gaze, slowly and with deliberate intention, toward the back of the room where Marcus Reed was sitting in the last row of chairs, his notebook open, his pen moving. If anyone feels they have a particularly unique approach to offer, Eleanor said, the inflection on the word unique, carrying just enough of a barb to be unmistakable, please do not hesitate. She was looking directly at him. The room understood the subtext. Marcus looked up from his notebook. He held Eleanor's gaze for a moment, calm and unhurried. Then he said, simply, I can try. The laughter began before Marcus had even reached the front of the room. It was not explosive or cruel, but it was real, the suppressed, socially complex laughter of people who are certain they are about to witness a public miscalculation. Someone near the middle of the room leaned over to whisper something to their neighbor. A graduate student in the second row, a confident, well-credentialed young man named Spencer, who had been Eleanor's teaching assistant for 2 semesters, pulled out his phone with a small, anticipatory smile. Eleanor herself stood to one side of the board with her arms loosely crossed, and the expression on her face was one of patient, generous allowance, the expression of someone who has decided to let a process play out because the outcome is not in doubt. "We'll give this a few minutes," she said pleasantly, and there was another ripple of soft laughter from the room. Marcus picked up the marker. He did not look at the audience. He did not look at Eleanor. He stood facing the board with the particular stillness of someone who has already completed this problem in his head and is now only engaged in the secondary task of transferring it to a surface where others can follow. He began with the foundational reframing, not the approach the problem seemed to invite, which operated within the constraints of the standard ergodic framework, but a lateral move that stepped outside those constraints entirely, treating the group action as a variable rather than a fixed parameter, and introducing a class of intermediate operators that allowed the measure preserving condition to be handled locally rather than globally. It was an elegant maneuver, and its elegance was immediately visible to anyone with sufficient background to read it. The first person in the room to notice was a visiting professor named Dr. Anita Sorensen, a specialist in dynamical systems from the University of Chicago, who had been invited to attend the colloquium as a distinguished guest. She had been half listening from the third row, reviewing notes on her tablet, when something in Marcus's first few lines caught her attention. She set the tablet down. She leaned forward. She put her glasses on. At the back of the room, Spencer's phone was still raised, but his expression had changed. The easy, anticipatory amusement was gone. In its place was something uncertain, something that belonged to a person who has just noticed the ground shifting beneath a previously stable assumption. Eleanor was still standing to the side of the board. Her arms were still crossed, but the slight smile she had been wearing, that proprietary patient smile of the person who has set the stage and is waiting for the expected result, had flattened. She was reading what Marcus was writing. Her brow had contracted by the smallest perceptible degree. Marcus continued working. The room had gone quiet in a way that was qualitatively different from the quiet of ordinary attention. It was the quiet of collective recalibration, the silence of people who have arrived at a place they did not expect to be and are now trying to orient themselves. An older faculty member named Professor Gerald Walsh, who had retired from active research 3 years earlier, but still attended the colloquium each year as a matter of institutional loyalty, slowly removed his glasses, cleaned them with the hem of his sweater, replaced them, and leaned forward with an expression of concentrated focus that had not been on his face in quite some time. He raised his hand slightly. "Wait," he said, quietly, but clearly enough to be heard across the room. "What method is he using?" Marcus did not pause when Professor Walsh spoke. He continued writing, moving through the intermediate steps with the measured pace of someone who knows exactly where each line is going before he writes it, whose hand is simply catching up to a completed thought. The operators he had introduced were not standard, they belonged to a framework that had emerged only in the last few years in the research literature, an approach that had been explored in a handful of papers, but had not yet made its way into mainstream pedagogy or standard graduate curricula. It was, in the most precise sense of the word, current. Not just current in the sense of recent, but current in the sense of being at the active frontier of the field, in the zone where the questions are still open and the tools for answering them are still being built. Dr. Sorensen rose from her chair. She did not do this dramatically, or with announcement. She simply stood, moved to the side of the room where she could see the board at a better angle, and stood there with her arms folded and her attention entirely concentrated on what Marcus was writing. Two other visiting faculty members noticed and followed her lead. Within minutes, a loose cluster of scholars had formed at the side of the room, all of them oriented toward the board with the focused, slightly urgent attention of people who have recognized something important. Eleanor had not moved from her position, but she was no longer wearing any expression that could be described as comfortable. The slight smile was completely gone. Her arms, which had been loosely crossed in the manner of someone observing a minor entertainment, had shifted. She had pressed one hand flat against the other forearm, a small, tight gesture that suggested a body renegotiating its relationship to the situation it found itself in. Marcus reached the final transformation. He paused for the first time not because he had lost his thread, but because the last step required a notation choice, and he selected one deliberately, writing it out in full rather than abbreviating, so that the logic of the jump would be visible to everyone following. Then he wrote the conclusion. He capped the marker. He set it in the tray. He stepped back from the board and turned to face the room. What Marcus had done was not only solve the problem, in the course of solving it, he had exposed a foundational assumption in the standard approach to problems of this type, an assumption so deeply embedded in the traditional framework that it had never been explicitly examined, simply inherited from paper to paper as an unquestioned starting condition. By approaching the problem from outside the standard framework, Marcus had made the assumption visible. He had demonstrated that it was not necessary. He had shown, with complete rigor, that removing it did not break the proof structure, but actually strengthened it. That the class of problems solvable by this method was strictly larger than the class addressed by the conventional approach. This was not a clever solution to a hard problem. This was a small but genuine contribution to the architecture of the field itself. The room was completely silent. Eleanor Hayes was staring at the board, not at Marcus, at the board. Her face held an expression that was very difficult to read, precisely because it was an expression she almost never wore, the expression of someone who does not know what to say. After the colloquium ended, and the room began to empty in the stunned, slightly dazed manner of an audience processing an unexpected event, Dr. Anita Sorensen made her way to the back of the room, where Marcus was collecting his notebook and his jacket with the same unhurried quiet with which he did everything. She introduced herself, though she suspected from the slight recognition in his eyes that he already knew who she was. She asked him, directly and without preamble, how long he had been working with the operator framework he had used at the board. Marcus told her he had been exploring it for roughly 2 years, since encountering a tangentially related paper in a Russian mathematics journal that he had tracked down through a citation chain in a preprint he had read the summer after his sophomore year. Sorensen listened to this with the expression of someone who is receiving information that is both surprising and, in retrospect, not surprising at all. Then she asked him about his publication history. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he said that he had published 2 papers, both under an abbreviated name MJ, read in mid-tier but peer-reviewed mathematics journals. He added, without apparent embarrassment, that he had preferred not to draw attention to them during his undergraduate years because he had wanted to keep his academic experience as normal as possible, insofar as that was still achievable. Sorensen asked him what the papers were about. The first, Marcus said, was an extension of a result in harmonic analysis that had been sitting unresolved for about 15 years. The second was a foundational piece on the operator class. He had used at the board today a theoretical framework paper that had been submitted, reviewed, and accepted without significant revision. Sorensen was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said that she was reasonably certain she had read the second paper. She asked him to confirm the title. He told her. She stood very still, and then she made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite an exclamation, but something in between the sound of a person placing a name next to a face and understanding, all at once, the full scope of what they are looking at. It turned out that Sorensen had not only read the paper, she had cited it. She had assigned it to her graduate students as supplementary reading at the start of the previous academic year. She had written a note in her own research journal, calling its central result unexpectedly elegant and likely to generate significant follow-on work. She had spent 6 months not knowing that the author was a 22-year-old undergraduate sitting in the back row of a classroom where a professor was routinely ignoring his raised hand. Before she left the colloquium building that evening, Sorensen found Marcus again near the exit and said, with the directness of someone who has stopped being surprised and moved into the register of the simply factual, "What you did today might change how people approach this entire class of problems. I want you to know that." Marcus thanked her. He walked out into the evening air, and the campus was quiet, and he had a bus to catch, and he was, as he had always been, entirely himself. The days following the colloquium were quiet on the surface and turbulent beneath it. Word traveled the way it does in academic departments, in office conversations and hallway exchanges and emails that began with, "Did you see what happened at the colloquium?" and ended with a level of astonishment proportional to the writer's familiarity with the mathematics involved. Dr. Sorensen sent 3 emails before she left campus, one to a colleague at MIT, one to the editor of a journal she was involved with, and one to the dean of the College of Natural Sciences at Hargrove, in which she described what she had witnessed with the precision of a scientist and the conviction of someone who does not often write letters of this kind. The dean of the department, a careful and methodical man named Dr. Charles Whitfield, initiated a quiet review. He asked the administrative staff to pull the academic files associated with Marcus Reed. What the files contained was, to anyone reading them carefully, remarkable. Marcus had maintained a 4-point grade average across all of his mathematics coursework. His thesis work, which was supervised by a faculty member outside the analysis group, had been flagged by the supervisor in an internal memo as the most sophisticated undergraduate research I have encountered in 23 years of teaching. His independent study records showed a breadth of reading that would have been unusual even for a doctoral student. And buried in the departmental correspondence files in the records of submissions to Hargrove's internal undergraduate research journal, which solicited papers from advanced students for possible publication, were 2 rejected submissions attributed to Marcus Reed. They had been submitted during his junior year. They had been reviewed and declined. Dr. Dakshin Whitfield pulled the review records. Both rejections were single-page documents. Neither contained a detailed mathematical critique. Both cited insufficiency of novelty and misalignment with current departmental research directions. Both bore, in the upper right corner of the review form, the initials of the reviewing faculty member, E.H. Dr. Whitfield, sat with this information for a long time before he decided what to do with it. Then he picked up his telephone and scheduled a meeting. The faculty meeting took place on a Wednesday afternoon in early December, in the long conference room on the 3rd floor of the mathematics building, with the tall windows that looked out over the frozen quad. It was not a public meeting. It was not announced. The people in the room were the senior faculty of the department, the dean, and Professor Eleanor Hayes. The documents on the table included Marcus's academic record, the 2 rejected submissions with their accompanying review forms, Dr. Sorensen's letter, and a printed copy of Marcus's second published paper, the framework paper, the one that Sorensen had cited, the one that was already generating attention in the research community, the one that bore the byline M.J. Reed. Eleanor had seen the paper before. She had seen it in a different context, without a face attached, without a name she recognized, without the weight of the preceding weeks pressing against it. She had read it and moved past it. Looking at it now, in this room, with this particular set of facts arranged around it, was a different experience entirely. The faculty went through the review forms slowly, and the conversation that followed was careful and professional and deeply uncomfortable. No one in the room was unkind to Eleanor, because the people in that room were not unkind people, and because the full weight of what had happened was becoming visible to everyone simultaneously, including Eleanor herself. One of the senior faculty, a woman named Professor Diana Chu, who had known Eleanor for 15 years, asked gently whether Eleanor had read both submissions in full before making her assessment. Eleanor said that she had. Then, after a pause that was 3 or 4 seconds long but felt considerably longer, she said that she was not certain she had given them the full attention they deserved. The room was quiet. Professor Chu asked whether Eleanor could elaborate on what she meant by that. Eleanor looked at the table. She looked at the documents. She looked at the initials in the upper right corner of the review forms, and they looked back at her with the particular insistence of facts that cannot be reinterpreted. She said that she believed she may have formed a prior assessment of the submissions before engaging fully with their content. She said this carefully, precisely, in the language of someone who is constructing a sentence very deliberately, because the sentence matters more than the words she would normally reach for. The room understood what she meant. Dr. Whitfield said that he would be asking Eleanor to formally reconsider both submissions and to provide detailed written responses to each. He said that the department would also be reviewing its submission and review processes more broadly. He said several other things, administrative and procedural, about standards and accountability. And Eleanor listened to all of them with a stillness that was entirely unlike her usual stillness, not the stillness of authority and certainty, but the stillness of a person who has arrived somewhere they did not intend to go and cannot find the road back. After the meeting ended and the other faculty left, Eleanor remained in the conference room alone. On her phone, she pulled up the video that Spencer had taken at the colloquium, the footage that had been circulating informally among the graduate students for the past week, that showed Marcus at the board working through the problem with his particular calm precision. She watched it without sound, all 6 minutes and 43 seconds of it. Then she watched it again. She could see herself in the edge of the frame, standing to the side with her arms crossed and her slight proprietary smile, and she could see the exact moment when the smile disappeared, and she could remember exactly what it had felt like from the inside, and she wished she could say that what it had felt like was surprise, because surprise would have been navigable. What it had actually felt like was recognition. Eleanor did not wait to be asked. She found Marcus the following Monday, in the late afternoon, when the building had mostly emptied, and the corridor outside the graduate study rooms was quiet. She knocked on the door of the small individual study room he had reserved for thesis work, and when he opened the door and saw her, his expression did not change in any of the ways she might have expected. He was not cold, not contemptuous, not visibly triumphant. He looked at her with the steady, measured calm that she had been misreading for 2 years as disengagement, and which she now recognized for what it had always been, the patience of someone who has learned to outlast the assumptions of the rooms he walks into. She asked if she could speak with him for a few minutes. He stepped aside and let her in. Eleanor had rehearsed this conversation many times over the preceding days. She had written versions of it in her notebook, deleted them, started again. She had practiced the words in her car and in the shower, and during the long, wakeful stretches of the preceding 2 nights. But when she sat down across from Marcus in the small, sparse study room, with the weak afternoon light coming through the narrow window, the rehearsed version felt inadequate, too formal, too managed, not honest in the ways that honesty actually required. So, she set aside the rehearsed version and said what was true. She said that she had allowed her assumptions about Marcus to shape the way she treated him in her classroom and in her capacity as a reviewer, and that those assumptions had not been based on his work or his performance or any form of evidence. They had been based on things that had nothing to do with mathematics and everything to do with who she had decided he was before. He had a chance to show her who he actually was. She said that she had dismissed his contributions in class, had looked past his raised hand on more occasions than she could account for, and had reviewed his submitted work with a speed and superficiality that she would have considered unacceptable had the submissions come from anyone else. She said she was ashamed of this. She said that she had been teaching mathematics for 23 years with the conviction that she was evaluating ideas on their merits, and the discovery that this conviction was not as accurate as she had believed was, she paused here. And the pause was not calculated, it was the genuine hesitation of someone fighting against the words it was shattering. Marcus listened to all of this without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected. He said that what had disappointed him most was not the skepticism. He understood skepticism. He had grown up with skepticism and had learned to work within it, and sometimes to use it the knowledge that the world would underestimate him had, in certain ways, made him more precise, more rigorous, more careful than he might otherwise have been. Skepticism he could navigate. What had been harder to navigate, he said, was the absence of opportunity. The moments when his hand was up and she looked past it. The submissions that were returned without genuine engagement. The specific, accumulated weight of never being given a fair starting point. You didn't doubt me because of my work, he said. You doubted me before my work. That's the part I kept coming back to. Eleanor did not respond for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was thinner than her usual voice, reduced in some way. She said she understood. She said that understanding it did not undo it, but that she understood it. Then she said she was sorry, not as a formality, not as a performance. She said it the way people say things when the words have been pulled out of them by something real. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said that he accepted her apology. He said it without warmth and without coldness, in the tone of someone who is being truthful about what acceptance actually means, that it is not absolution, and it is not forgetting, and it is not the restoration of something lost, but that it is real nonetheless, and that it is what he was able to offer. Eleanor stood. She thanked him. She walked out into the corridor and stood there for a moment in the empty hallway, with the specific heaviness of someone who has done the right thing and knows that doing it did not make any of the other things not have happened. 1 year passed. It passed the way years do when they are full of work quickly in retrospect, exhaustingly in real time. Marcus completed his undergraduate thesis, which his supervisor submitted to 3 journals simultaneously on the grounds that it was strong enough to survive that level of scrutiny without waiting for sequential responses. It was accepted by the second journal to respond, and the acceptance letter contained a line, in the editor's note, that described the result as an important clarification of the foundational landscape of the field. He graduated in May, quietly, with his parents in the audience, his mother in the green dress she saved for significant occasions, his father with the same expression of focused, precise pride with which he had always looked at his son, the expression of a man watching someone become fully what they were always going to be. Marcus entered a doctoral program at MIT in the fall, under the supervision of a faculty member he had chosen carefully, a mathematician named Professor Leslie Amano, who had built her career on boundary problems precisely like the ones Marcus had been working on since he was in his early 20s. He published his framework paper in a top-tier journal that fall, under his full name, without the abbreviation he had used before. The paper circulated widely. It was discussed at conferences. It appeared in the syllabi of 3 graduate courses before the academic year was out. At a workshop in November, a senior mathematician from Stanford had said publicly, in a session on emerging research directions, that the paper represented exactly the kind of structural rethinking that this subfield has needed for a decade. In March, Marcus received an invitation to speak at an international conference in Edinburgh, not as a graduate student attendee, but as a featured speaker in the main program, alongside faculty whose careers were measured in decades. He was 23 years old. He had a presentation slot of 45 minutes and had already spent more time on it than he would ever admit to anyone. And in April, he came back to Hargrove. He came back because Dr. Whitfield had extended an invitation, on behalf of the department, to deliver the annual Colson Lecture, a prestigious endowed talk that typically went to established senior researchers and had never, in its 30-year history, been delivered by someone still in the first year of their doctorate. Marcus had accepted without fanfare. He had said yes, and then he had gone back to his work. On the evening of the Colson Lecture, the main auditorium of the mathematics building was full in a way it had not been in several years. The faculty were there, and the graduate students, and many undergraduates who had heard about what had happened at the colloquium the previous November and wanted to see for themselves what the person at the center of that story actually looked like and sounded like. There were visiting scholars from other departments, people who had read the framework paper and wanted to put a face to the name. There were 2 journalists from the university's science publication who had requested press seats and who sat in the second row with notebooks. Marcus walked onto the stage at 7:15 in the evening in a dark jacket over a plain white shirt and stood behind the lectern for a moment while the room settled. He looked out over the audience with the same steady calm with which he had always occupied rooms unhurried, present, not performing anything. Then he began to speak. He spoke for 45 minutes without notes, covering the theoretical landscape of his work with the precision and clarity of someone who has explained these ideas so many times in his own head that the explanation has become second nature. He was not flashy. He did not try to entertain. He simply told the truth about what he had found, and why it mattered, and where he thought it led, and the room listened with the quality of attention that genuine understanding produces, not passive, not performative, but active and alive people leaning forward slightly in their seats, making notes, following the logic as it built. When he finished, the applause began before he had fully stepped back from the lectern. It built quickly and then sustained itself, and after a moment, it became what it became: the full, standing kind. The kind that a room produces, not as a social reflex, but as something more honest, a physical acknowledgement of the gap between what was expected and what arrived. The sound of it filled the auditorium. Marcus stood at the lectern and let it happen, with the small private smile of someone who has never needed the room's approval, but is willing to receive it when it comes. In the third row, slightly to the right of center, Eleanor Hayes was standing with everyone else. She was wearing a dark blazer, and her reading glasses were pushed up on her forehead in the way she always wore them when she was not actively using them. She was clapping. There was no performance in it, no calculation, no self awareness about how the gesture read from the outside. She was simply a person in a room who had witnessed something worth acknowledging it, the arrogance that had defined her for so long, the elegant, well credentialed, academically sophisticated arrogance that she had carried for 2 decades like a second credential, polished and displayed and carefully maintained, was absent. In its place was something simpler and more costly: respect, the kind that costs something because it requires the prior dismantling of the thing that stood where it now stands. Marcus found his parents in the corridor after the event. His mother hugged him for a long time. His father shook his hand, then pulled him into a brief, tight embrace and said nothing, because the expression on his face said everything that needed saying. Later, walking back through the mathematics building toward the exit, Marcus passed the corridor where the colloquium room was located. The whiteboard inside was clean, the chairs were empty. The room was exactly as it always was, unaware of its own history, ready for whatever would happen in it next. He kept walking. There was still work to do, and he was already thinking about it. And the evening air outside was very cold and very clear, and the city spread itself out before him, with all of its ordinary, unresolved complexity. And he walked into it the same way he had always walked into everything: without announcement, without performance, with the quiet and complete confidence of someone who has always known, in the place where knowing actually lives, exactly who he is. There is a particular kind of error that the brilliant and credentialed are most vulnerable to, not the error of ignorance, which can be corrected with information, but the error of certainty, which resists correction precisely because it wears the face of knowledge. It is the error of people who have been right so many times, in so many rooms, in front of so many audiences, that they have stopped distinguishing between the experience of being right and the act of actually checking. It is the error of mistaking a long record of accurate judgment for infallibility, of confusing earned authority with the license to stop looking carefully at what is directly in front of you. Eleanor Hayes had not lacked intelligence. She had not lacked achievement. She had not lacked the genuine ability to recognize mathematical quality when she encountered it, as her published work and her long career amply demonstrated. What she had lacked was the capacity to imagine that quality might arrive in a form she had not pre-approved, that it might sit in the back row in worn sneakers, that it might offer an alternative approach in a measured, unhurried voice, that it might submit work through departmental channels without the institutional pedigree that she had unconsciously decided was the precondition for serious attention. And this, in the end, was a more consequential failure than any she had ever made at the blackboard. The world is full of rooms where the wrong person is ignored because the right people are not paying the right kind of attention. The world is full of notebooks closed in back rows, of hands raised and looked past, of submissions returned without real reading. Most of these moments are not dramatic. They do not have witnesses. They do not produce colloquiums, or standing ovations, or letters from distinguished visiting professors. They simply produce a person who goes home and keeps working, and either persists until the room can no longer avoid them, or exhausts themselves against the weight of not being seen and stops. Marcus had persisted, not because persistence is a substitute for justice, it is not. And the fact that it worked for him does not make the years of dismissal acceptable or the structure that produced them anything other than what it was. He had not persisted in order to prove anything to anyone. He had not persisted out of defiance or anger or the need to stage a public reckoning. He had persisted because the mathematics was real, and because the questions it raised were real, and because the relationship between his mind and those questions was not contingent on whether any particular room acknowledged it. The work existed independent of the permission of the rooms that housed it. And Marcus had understood this at some fundamental level long before the colloquium, long before the auditorium, long before anyone outside a small circle of anonymous peer reviewers had known to attach a face to the initials M. J. Reed. He had persisted because the work was real, and because the work mattered to him, and because at some deep and inarticulate level, he had always understood that the question of whether he belonged in these rooms was not the room's question to answer. It was his. Genius, it turns out, does not announce itself in the ways that institutions have been trained to recognize. It does not always come trailing credentials and recommendations and the right kind of last name and the right kind of face and the right kind of origin story. Sometimes it sits in the back of the room in a gray hoodie, working in a notebook, raising its hand and having the hand looked past, and waiting not passively, not helplessly, but with the specific patience of someone who knows what they carry and is willing to wait for the moment when it becomes undeniable. The greatest mistake a person can make is not the absence of knowledge. It is the conviction that they already know everything relevant about another person before that person has had the chance to show them anything at all. The decision, made in an instant and rarely examined afterward, that the shape of a story can be read from its cover, that the value of a mind can be assessed from the row it chooses to sit in. Eleanor Hayes had made that mistake. She had made it in a room full of witnesses, and she had been made to see it, and the seeing had cost her something real. Whether that cost had changed her in any permanent way, whether the lesson had reached the place where lessons that actually change people have to reach, was not a question anyone else could answer for her. That was her own work, and it would take as long as it took, and no one else could do it for her. Marcus Reed, for his part, was already in Edinburgh, sitting in a hotel room with a legal pad and a pen, working on the next problem. Outside the window, the city went about its business in the grey Scottish morning, indifferent and beautiful, and he wrote without stopping, because that was what he had always done, and what he would always do, and no one in any room had ever had the power to take that from him.